Hello and welcome to today's Wolfram Institute live stream. Today we have Damaris Kroeber, and she'll be talking about the Ruliad and philosophical implications of observer theory.
Awesome.
Damaris,
Thank you,
take it over.
Dugan. Hello, everybody. I'm Damaris. Let me share my screen for my presentation. Oh, okay. Oh, look at this. We just got signed out from being 5 minutes ago. Give me 1 second.
No problem.
That is hilarious. Thank you, Google.
Tech gremlins.
Yeah. It's like, you just looked at it. We're sure you don't want to see this again. Okay, here we go. Okay.
Perfect.
Awesome. You can see the presentation?
Yes,
The full
yes,
screen
it's
on?
coming through.
Alrighty, yes. As Dugan said, today I want to talk about the Ruliad, which is the totality of all computation in the Wolfram framework. Before we get started, just a brief introduction to myself. Yeah, I'm Damaris. I used to do physics for about a decade, mostly on the quantum side, theoretical, experimental, and applied. Later transitioned into finance, then startups, and started coming across the same question over and over again, which was like, why are people making the decisions that they're making? And that became a whole rabbit hole, which, in the end, you have to figure out things like, how do people build cells? And then you need to answer, what is consciousness? Which, of course, we know we don't have an answer for. But yeah, while I was doing all of that, I was starting to realize we need a whole new language in order to start bringing all of these things together, because they are intersecting with physics a lot too, especially the foundational theories. And so I knew Stephen's work and I've been following it. And I was very happy to be at the Wolfram Summer School this year, a month ago, and to dive into using the Wolfram framework, and especially the fact that the Ruliad exists as an abstract possibility to explore very important questions at the foundations of our human experience. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, so as you can hear, that was quite the journey for me. Definitely never thought I would end up there. So we're actually going to go on a little journey too. I think there's probably a lot of scientists on here, and in the first part, we're actually going to look at why might we even need a new framework beside the one that we usually use in the sciences. So like the physicalist idea of, we have space-time and quantum fields, and from there, all of reality builds up. Why might we even need something else? And then I will be, we'll be going over some ideas there, and I'll be showing some very interesting data that we're getting in a much more concise way about human experience that's very unusual. And then we'll see how the Ruliad comes into all of that, and then using the framework, the Wolfram framework, why we might be able to answer all these big questions in a way better way than before. So that's planned for today. And feel free to ask questions at any time. Dugan is going to monitor the YouTube live chat to ideally put in the slide number first, so we know what the question refers to. And yeah, let's make this a little bit interactive if you all want to. Actually, we're going to start out a little bit interactive, though this is probably going to be more for the people here on Zoom, and or people in the YouTube live chat can, of course, answer to what color is this dress? I think we all know this dress. It's been a controversy for the last 10 years. Dugan, what do you think? What color is this?
On my monitor here, it looks a little bluish, and the
Little
black
bluish.
the
Okay.
black stripes are kind of, maybe it's like the way it's reflecting sunlight or something. Maybe it's sort of like an outdoor market, but it looks kind of like yellowish, goldish on the dark stripes.
Okay, on the dark stripes. Yeah, well, to me, this is incredibly white and very brightly gold. There is absolutely zero blue and zero black in there anywhere, which is, I mean, isn't it amazing? We actually have not conclusively solved yet why humans see it that in that different way. But this is just like I mean, it's a fun little exercise. Also, this is not the original image. This is one generated by ChatGPT, supposed to mimic the original image. And still, we do get that illusion of like different people seeing different colors. Um, and that is just one way to start questioning our perception of reality, all the stuff that we take to be real. Like we're just picking up on a real physical world, and then we use our equations in physics to describe that physical world. That is basically the big question. The big question is that actually true? We have. I brought you another one. I took this yesterday in an art museum. Let me see, I can make this bigger probably. Maybe not. So yeah, I don't know if you were able to tell, but these were actually pyramidical shapes that were painted, but then they looked like scenes that were changing. And again, we all know these optical illusions, but it's actually pretty impressive then to be like, well, okay, if we're struggling with that, something that big and that obvious, what might we actually really be picking up on here? And we actually, somebody actually, oh no, not the video again. Next slide, please. Somebody, which is Donald Hoffman, actually went and was like, okay, well, let's test it. We're scientists. Let's test it. And what he did is he took the equations of evolution and he used game theory in various versions and was like, okay, well, does it make more sense for us to perceive as much of objective reality as possible? So to get as much of the truth about the realities that's out there, or is it better for us if we just kind of, survive because we have some optimized fitness function? His assumption back in the day was like, okay, no, objective truth surely beats everything, but no. What they were able to show is that every single time, fitness beats truth. So if evolution holds true, which we currently believe is a fact, then there is no way that the way we evolved over the last 100 whatever million years to see anything objectively true. We do see the things that help us survive, but doesn't have to be the truth. Now that's really interesting because again, when we build our physical theories, usually the assumption is, well, the stuff that we're seeing or interacting with, that is reality. Well, I mean, philosophers have been saying different things for a long time, but as physicists, not necessarily. So he calls it the user. Yes. Any question?
Yeah. So it's like, we perceive just enough to have like a workable model for the world that's advantageous to our needs. Also,
Yes.
it's not like it's having all this information and like cutting it down and saying, oh, we just need this part. I think it's more of like evolutionarily speaking, it's coming from like the bottom up. I mean, it's like we have like older forms of our organism, like in the past, like we had very limited sensory perception, and then we like grew these sensory apparatuses to like reach out and pick little bits of information from the world and then like bring that into our sensory perception. So it's like we get more and more refined with our senses um, to get closer to what the truth is, or as whatever features of that objective reality as can. But it's like it's working from the bottom up. It's getting more like detailed as needed.
Yes and no, probably not. So we're
Okay.
picking up on real patterns. So, like that table in front of me, that is still a real informational pattern. Also, that train that is coming towards me, I should step out of the way. It is going to have consequences. But it is called user interface theory in the sense of like, that laptop in front of you, it has icons and apps, and you click on the apps and they open, and maybe you type something and you have no idea that there might be electrons underneath and circuits and how they all switch and whatnot and how memory is stored. You don't need to know that. You also never manipulate it. You cannot even access it. And that is probably more of reality. So the version that we have that we're perceiving, most likely, according to these studies, is that we just have some summarized versions where we pick up real patterns. But even if they become more and more pronounced or, fine grained, it doesn't mean we're actually getting closer to anything of like objective truth. Now, I personally would argue math can get us there to some degree, but in terms of the senses, so sense perception, we're just working with like some very wonky but very effective icons.
I agree with you there. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is, I think, something really important to keep in mind, because even in physics, right, we still have theories that assume that that world, that physical world we see around us, that is what we have to explain, in not as a pattern, but like as ultimate truth. And probably not the best approach, at least if we take in this data. And then talking about physics, most of us physicists, we still learn like when we come to foundational theories like quantum theory, we learned Copenhagen interpretation. Other interpretations are currently gaining footing, but a lot of them are still saying, there's a lot of quantum weirdness that happens, right? We have superpositions, like, a cat is both dead and alive. We have the problem of the whole measurement thing. So quantum world where the wave function, unless you're a many worlds person, you'd say, okay, that's just a mathematical tool, but that doesn't really tell us about, real world or objective truth. Like it's just what we measure in the end, that is that. So there's a lot of back and forth, but mostly, I would say in my experience, we feel pretty good about our theories and that we're capturing the phenomena really well, and especially we're assuming like a certain amount of like space-time and like how we go through that space-time as a basis. Now, we did have a great talk by Jacob Barandes at the summer school, and he showed us an alternative formulation to quantum mechanics. Obviously, there's a lot of them out there, but I thought his was very impressive, and he was showing that we can recover all the known equations as well as probably empirical results of quantum mechanics with a stochastic approach that has zero weirdness, except for maybe the thing that you kind of need to know the whole history of your system. So since the beginning of the universe, his type of history, in order to get correct results. Now, that shows us, I think, which is really interesting, that we should consider our foundational theories currently as a lens into the world. And I think we intuitively do it a little bit, but we also smuggle in a little like, oh, no, this is how the world works. When really, we should be really aware that in terms of perception, we're picking up on patterns, yes, and that there are different ways of describing these patterns. We have fitness optimized perception, and we have great lenses, how we can start describing them, even the stuff we don't even necessarily pick up with our senses, though, a measurement we still read out with our senses, and the experiments we devise are still based on what we expect to read out. But yes, we have lenses and fitness optimized perception. But the question about ultimate truth is actually a pretty dicey one. But it doesn't stop at the matter stuff. Then there is the mind stuff. Now here is where more of the philosophy or science people would probably be interested in that part. But it turns out that is also going to be very important going forward if we want to keep developing our theories of the universe and the fabric of reality. So mind, or usually what we consider our own thoughts, our own experiences, our own subjectivity, the fact that we use I and that I is experiencing something, actually doesn't just exist in that version of the I, which is a first person perspective. It actually also exists in a what people now start calling a zeroth person perspective. That is where that I dissolves, senses dissolve, color perception dissolves, and everything becomes kind of one. Now, that sounds very mystical and spiritual and woo-woo. However, we have great data, quantitative and qualitative on this. Obviously, we know from philosophers as well as especially other cultures, in the Eastern traditions, that humans have reported this across the centuries, in all cultures, across all age groups. However, we do have more systemized studies of this now, especially by this German philosopher and cognitive scientist, Thomas Metzinger. And he wrote a great book of it, The Elephant and the Blind. Now, I'm going to show you 3 quotes so that we kind of start getting familiar with it, unless you have deep meditative experiences and, by chance have come across this type of existence. It's going to be very unfamiliar to our mind of objects that exist very clearly and I can touch them and they're definitely different from me. versus these other type of experiences where all the differentiation goes away. But yes, he has studied it. He's we're going to read some more about, and then we're going to ask ourselves, okay, if we take this data as seriously as we take our own usual existence data, the one we're having right now, well, what does it tell us about the world? Especially, what does it tell us about the fabric of the universe? So here are 3 quotes. One person said, I experience pure consciousness as a state of unboundedness and total ease and deep relaxation. There are no thoughts, no feelings, or any other sensation like weight or temperature. I just know I am. There's no notion of time or space, but my mind is fully awake and perfectly clear. It is a very simple and natural state. And I think this is very interesting in what we usually assume, right? Like if we were to switch off our senses, if we were to switch off our thoughts, especially, right? All these thoughts that are going through our mind, no matter if you have them verbally or in pictures, like we would just be numb, right? That would be the assumption. We'd just be numb and like, nothing would be happening. The world would kind of be just like switch off, like be in darkness and numb and a vegetable in the corner of a dark room type of thing. Well, that's not what happens. Turns out if we seem to switch off all these reality building circuitry, we actually end up with in totality with a state of complete unboundedness that is crystal clear, perfectly clear, very awake. People actually describe it as being much more alive, almost like much more awake than normal existence. Here's another one. Outside on the street, there was a sound, and that in that moment, it was clear to me that it is not a self that perceives the sound, but there is awareness in with the sound. There existed a perception that the sound appears in space with awareness and recognizes itself. Other perceptions, like visual objects, bodily sensations, were also appearances, off with awareness, without being tied to a perceiver or being perceived by a perceiver. Just an appearance of appearances. This experience view has no mystical quality, but a quality of ordinary suchness. It simply is the way it is. 1 minute amazing and full of joy, but at the same time, very simple. This is also very important here where, especially where they're talking about anything not being tied whatsoever to a perceiver or being perceived. Now, we cannot imagine that. Our model of the self. So as we sit here, right, we're optimizing for physical stability. That happens mostly unconsciously. We happen for mind integrity, and we might use ideology or religion, whatever education told us in order to be stable there. But at any moment in time that we're awake, we usually run this self model. Now, it's not a static quantity. It is something that helps us, keep a nice narrative, keep the world coherent, keep a nice thread of experience happening that helps us survive better. Now that goes away. There is no more, this core thing, this one thing that looks out at the world and, tries to optimize for it and survive in it. All of that disappears. And with it, with the differentiation disappearing, also it disappears all the differences between a sound here, me here, or an object there, me here. All of that also disappears. And yet again, there is a version of perception. Like again, words, we can't use really words here. We use words after the fact, and they all fail us because obviously words are differentiated. That's why they're so useful for us. But all of that exists simultaneously, and all there seems to be is this very clear, very simple awareness that has no feelings. Now, this is going to be important for all of you philosophers, especially the idea of qualia, so the quality of existence that seems so ungraspable. Well, not even that's there. It's just very simple. Last but not least.
So this is concentrating on just
yes.
the sensory perception, the qualia, and you're not like thinking it's me that's hearing this sound. There's just sound, and not even I see it or hear it. It's just hearing the sound. Is that
Yes,
accurate?
it is. I can't tell you. I haven't had an experience like this. So I'm just will have to trust the data on this. But it seems to be more like imagine. I like to think about it sometimes in terms of like, when you think of quantum fields and you have excitations and those are the particles. But in the end, they're all coming from like the same thing type of thing. that's how I imagine it, that, you know, the sense of, and we'll see it later, we'll have something similar for the Ruliad, but they're all kind of coming from the same thing. And usually we're on this level of where they all look distinct, but in that moment we're actually realizing that there's just this one thing, while being aware that there might be some potential for differentiation, I guess. It is mind messing. It is probably one of the things that will always be hard to understand from this first person perspective of differentiation that is our normal. And you know, maybe, I don't know, maybe we should have meditation as part of the curricula for physics going forward, especially for philosophers. I mean, they're definitely already behind on that, but who knows? Who knows? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you said you've never had an experience like this where there's just a I mean, you used you in that sentence about that. It's like, okay, when there's an experience of a qualia, and that's going into some thread of experiencing, right? Is that thread of experiencing like somebody or like a
So
self?
yeah, so I think, so people in the zeroth person perspective say that there is no such thing as experience. There is no such thing as perception. There is no there is no differentiation. It's completely a world of no differentiation. And then when you use the words afterwards, after you come out of the experience and you remember it, you use words afterwards to describe it. It's you have to pull on threads, and that's the threads that people will use. But yes, it's not there. There is no experience. It's just kind of this crystal clearness where things are happening. But there's no reflection on it either. There's no, yeah, it's all I can say about it.
Cool.
Yeah. But it's very important data. I think the point is that I'm trying to make here, before I read the last quote, is that I mean, we need to build our theories based on data and insights that we have. And when it comes to the whole question on like consciousness, but even how we build theories in physics is, right, we always assumed, so physicists, we usually assume the third person view, right, that we can look at a thing, isolate it, you know, like put it under a microscope and then describe it. And that is a valid way of doing science. And it has worked wonderfully, right? We are picking up on the patterns, we're describing them with amazing math that is, you know, very hard to understand at this point usually. And it works. But that always assumes like that just, you know, that there is a separation between what we're looking at versus the person looking at it. And then the philosophers came in and they're like, oh, no, you shouldn't be even, you know, you shouldn't be ignoring the person looking, like that is going to have some influence on it. And now I'm telling you, no, we have even more, which says like none of these views is really privileged. There's something way more foundational there. And, you know, what might we get out if we actually take that seriously? That is basically what I'm showing you, both on the well, the way we build physical theories. Maybe we should be a little bit aware of, you know, how perception, our way of being in the world already works just from from the lens and the fitness optimization. But also there's a whole other way that is very valid data that we haven't even taken into account. And if we don't, we're probably not going to do the next leap in science and or on questions of consciousness.
Um,
Okay, that was a little
so
going ahead, but let me go get through this quote really quick. Experience of the deepest level, that of pure consciousness, awake to its own nature in and by itself. That's really important. So there's no classifier, no outside classification, no pointing towards it. You know, this is they use consciousness again. Words are difficult here. It is in and by itself. It is generally held to be especially important. The defining characteristics of this experience is the complete absence of all sounds, taste, thoughts, feelings, images, and anything else that one can ever imagine. Techniques for achieving this experience differ, but they have in common the idea that it is possible for all empirical content to disappear while one nevertheless remains awake. Again, there's not a zero, but there is something very much there after everything what we usually hold dear disappears.
so
What
this
then
is
is the
just
experience like?
oh sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just finish really quick. By all accounts, it is not like anything. One can have it and remember it. One knows that one was not asleep, but one does not remember it as anything at all. It's just itself unimaginable and indescribable. really quick pointer there. For all of you who are familiar with like questions about consciousness, we don't have a good definition for it. Usually people like to, use the one by Thomas Nagel, who says, well, whatever, something is like, that is what consciousness is. Well, people apparently have experiences that are not like anything. So even that, a little fragile definition of consciousness actually doesn't hold if we want to describe the whole phenomenon. Okay, Dugan, I'm sorry.
So this is experience without qualia. I would say that would kind of be like just a black void,
And yet it's not.
but more
Though,
blank
to be
than
fair,
that. It's like,
yeah.
okay, you can close your eyes and you could like put something over your eyes so that you're seeing total black, right? But you're only experiencing that qualia like in a cone, a field of view that's like in front of you. A question is like, what about the blackness that you see behind your head or that you don't see? That's more of a nothing's there than the blackness you see when you close your eyes.
Yeah, I mean, usually we would say that because of the self model, we would have a projection, a hypothesis, what is, behind us, or the blackness. And as for blackness, so people who go deeper and deeper into this experience, so it comes in stages. The deeper you get, so the more you dissolve, people will actually sometimes end up in like a dark void type of experience, but after having experienced like an insane richness that cannot be described because it's undifferentiated, and words or concepts are always differentiated. But the blackness, the darkness is a very special state, I believe, that eventually some people get to, but it's not the normal experience of the zeroth person.
Lucas is asking how near-death experiences do they fit into this discussion?
That, Lucas, give me 2 slides and we will be talking about this. Yes.
And Flo is asking,
yeah.
sorry, how do we know that these accounts are reliable? Are we reliable observers?
Well, how reliable is our subjective experience of like me talking right now, and you guys have no idea what's happening inside of my mind. It's a little bit along those lines, right? Which is why in science we usually bracket it out. We're like, we don't want anything to do with it. Like, we'll just look at the stuff that we can measure, touch, weigh, whatever. But this whole like subjectivity, like whatever, we don't want it. Well, it's starting to look pretty important. So I think we're getting better at maybe taking people a little bit more serious when they try to describe the inner subjective experience. Now, as for this zeroth person perspective, again, this is not new, right? I mean, Buddhism has had these insights. Now they have a language that we Westerners don't necessarily understand, but they've had insights along those lines for millennia. We've had Christian mysticism, Islamic mysticism that also would talk about exactly the same things. Now, the words differ, but actually the pattern that they show is all the same. I think what is special now, maybe for us Westerners, is that somebody here, which is a team of neuroscientists and this philosopher, have actually done a qualitative and quantitative study. And they've shown it is a very common experience across, again, all age groups, all cultures, especially the European cultures. Even there is a very common experience that people encounter, but because we can't speak about it, and because we don't have any markers in our cultures, not in the religions, not in the national cultures, it's just a conversation that's not happening. So, but that's why the book is called The Elephant and the Blind. There is an elephant in the room, it's a very common experience, and we're starting to actually put the resources behind it to chronicle that, at least for the Western sphere, and also use language obviously that's easier for us to access than the traditions from the Eastern Eastern traditions. But yeah, it is still nothing we can measure. I mean, and we'll probably always. No, there is a very interesting study that was done a long time ago. I think they're more underway, where they use nuns and monks that are very good at getting into these deep meditative states, and they put them in an MRI. Now that's as close as we can get, and they all showed the same pattern, which is actually that There's not a special brain circuit that goes on when you go into these zeroth person perspective or deep meditative states. Is actually what happens is that most of your brain starts powering down. So we're seeing, circuitry going offline, especially circuitry in the left brain. So a lot of the planning, goal-directed behavior, all that jazz. We see both in the language, in the witness accounts, across cultures, and in the first medical data that we have incredibly consistent in the data. I think that is what we have to trust at this point.
So the left side, that's interesting. So the Broca's area for speech is in the left side, if I'm not mistaken. And so would you say that that's evidence that like the inner monologue is like dampened?
The inner monologue is gone. That's really important because the inner monologue is, that's part of your self-model that narrates the world to you. I think people can have that experience also just kind of randomly. We're not always aware. But I remember that one time it happened to me and oh my gosh, that was that was glorious. Oh, that was such a relief. But yes, inner monologue, right? So speech is differentiation. Usually the inner monologue is a part inside of you. So it's a fragment of the self-model that has a function. You can have several parts that have different dialects. People report voices, right, with different dialects, with different intonations, different emotions. All of these are basically parts for the mind to stay coherent. And all of that, of course, then goes offline when you lose the first person perspective on the world. And that's what we see in those MRI studies. Now, the left-right brain side, it's a little controversial because people can have right brain activity even during speech and stuff. So we shouldn't, people get very upset if you start talking about left-right brain stuff. So we shouldn't go there. But yes, speech center is usually in the left, and that definitely goes offline.
Do you think Neuralink type of interfaces would aid this discussion or this investigation?
Yeah, so I haven't thought about it. From what I understand, I think it stimulates brain regions, which is probably not what you want. You want them to quiet. So, but I don't know.
Yeah, from what I've seen, it can go both ways. You just kind of put in these probes, and they'll measure like neuronal activity for certain individual neurons, and then there's just the passive mode, kind of reading what's happening, and then you can do an active mode where you're stimulating those neurons electrically with very low voltage. But that's I think that's something that's hasn't been done yet, but on the horizon for Neuralink.
I would love that. Like, if I'm just following the voice going quiet, like, oh my gosh, that was so amazing. So sign me up for that. But yeah, I think the really important thing is what we know. It's definitely a whole brain. So it's global networks in the brain that where stuff happens. And again, they go quiet. So if you can stimulate the brain in a way that things actually go quiet, then perhaps yes. Now, psychedelics actually do a lot of this. But yeah, no, we're having more research on that, so that should be promising to get better data. But yeah. Anyway, just a conclusion that's really important, that the existence from the zeroth person perspective, so taking these accounts seriously, is that all subjectivity and self-modeling actually dissolves. And we do not end up in zero, in nothingness, which, if you're like, okay, I have 2 points and differentiation dissolves, well then, x1 minus x2 goes to 0. I end up in nothingness and 0, like blank. No. Actually, what happens is that the totality opens up and everythingness opens up that is undifferentiated. And, let's look at if we take this data seriously. Now, of course, people are trying to understand this. So Metzinger himself and his collaborators have proposed an active inference models, which is basically saying whatever we perceive, it's not that there's a world and we perceive it and then we build it in our brains. No, what's happening is we have a model of how the world works and we simulate it, and then we just check, with whatever perception comes through, we basically error correct on that model. That is what active inference is. And they're like, okay, so that means we have simulating circuitry in our brain, and there's one special one, and it is the one I am expecting knowledge circuitry. So apparently that's how they would like, so they want to stay in our traditional scientific view, and they're like, okay, if we assume that humans just have some circuitry that's literally just, I'm expecting knowledge, I'm expecting something to come in, and if that is running on empty, meaning that one is running, but none of the lower levels of like sense perception, emotions, narrative self, if none of these are running, just that one loop, well then, maybe we should be able to get out this whole undifferentiated, this whole I'm very aware and aware, I'm still, taking in all this knowledge around me, I'm still aware of my surroundings, but it's not differentiated anymore. Maybe that's how we can model it. Now, if you want to model it, there's a great price competition, by the way. You just have to write paper until the 30th of September, in case somebody's interested. But I personally think that, I think it's important to look at it. I doubt that is how we're going to solve this very interesting question. Why? And this is, Lucas, where your question comes in. Well, first of all, it's a very epistemically limited as an explanation. So as I told you with the MRI studies, right? So most of the brain goes offline or quiets down, and we just have certain circuitry in the right brain that it actually stays active and probably, gets more into your awareness. Now that would fit the Metzinger model. But what we cannot distinguish, at least not as far as I know, is, well, we usually just measure brain correlates. So if the brain goes offline, doesn't mean because there's some circuitry that goes offline and then just this empty, knowledge expecting loop is just running in, by itself, just looking at itself. Is that what's happening? Or are these circuits going offline and the deeper reality is actually able to show up? Because all that averaging and all this, like, oh, we need to fit it into some survival fitness-based perception, all of, if that goes offline, and then we just have some minimal brain circuitry left, is that then basically, are we removing a stranglehold on the on what is actually out there? And that one we probably cannot resolve in the Metzinger model. Now I might be wrong on this, but I don't like that. That is not a good explanation. But interestingly, what Lucas was saying, yes, we have actually anecdotal contradictions. Now, again, we don't have conclusive data on this, mostly because, try to get funding for this. Right. So, but there are anecdotes from, especially from the operating room. So people that were clinically dead, had no heartbeat, so no brain activity, being able, and then especially this one case where a woman was, I think, born blind, something like that. And she was able to report back after being brought back to life, after coming out of anesthesia, being able to report exactly what was happening in the operating room, like very weird details. I think something like a pen fell out of a doctor's office pocket and like rolled somewhere, something like that, and conversation snippets. So there are these anecdotes, which of course, like, how do you verify that? It's difficult, but there are anecdotal differences, anecdotal contradictions, which I think should, make us pause and be like, maybe we should allocate some funding there. I would like that. But yes, the next one is, if the Metzinger model is correct, then we are limited to our physical local existence, right? So even if our sense perception were off, though we're still taking in data through that epistemic loop, we would still be limited to only whatever's happening around us, because it's a physicalist model. However, if that's not the case, if we're removing a stranglehold on maybe some deeper part of reality, then actually we should be able to also access, information that is not tied to our local, like our position in space and time. And now we do again have anecdotes of near-death experiences that report exactly that. So I personally, for the because it's also much more fun, I'm gonna embrace the whole we're removing a stranglehold, but just keep in mind the jury's out on that, right? So if we remove the stranglehold by going into the zeroth person perspective, now that means we have a whole new part of reality that we should be able to explain. And philosophers have been trying, and religious scholars, of course, have been trying for 2,500 years at this point, but language really fails us. We need something better, and math is obviously a great agnostic framework to do that, anything math-based, and yes, which is where we will get to the Ruliad in a second, but just to make my position clear, we're now gonna go down the rabbit hole of like, no, we're gonna take the zeroth person perspective literally, seriously, and we're gonna assume that it is uncovering a deeper part of reality that is there, but we usually don't perceive.
Quick question
Now,
from Lucas.
yes.
Is it possible to connect consciousness with the concept of entropy?
Oh, there are people who do that. I am not familiar with these theories, so I would have to look into that. Or Lucas, give me some more details on what you were thinking there exactly. Maybe I can answer that. We'll be talking about consciousness towards the end of this. Yes, we can try. We can try again.
Yeah, I mean, to speak to that, it's like entropy is an information sort of context. It's like when you have like you know, a bit string or an image, and let's say it's all white pixels, uh, that has very low entropy, and it's just very
Yes.
easy to state that as a description. Um, but entropy comes in when there's like details and things happening in the image, and you have to have more information content to accurately describe everything that's happening. And uh, consciousness is sort of like an attention agent, and you attend to areas of your sensory perception that are like more detailed and nuanced, or that stand out to you, that surprise you. So in that sort of sense, like I can draw an analogy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's remember that attention is also only something that exists in the first person. That is not something that you have as a zeroth person perspective, which, yes, I was going to talk about later, but a lot of the current big contenders of theories of consciousness is basically just based on that. There's this subjective experience that's very special. We should be able to explain it. And then we have all these concepts of attention, of qualia, so like qualitative experience that we supposedly cannot explain, how special feelings, emotions is, the redness of red, all that jazz. Again, all disappears in the zeroth person perspective, just an emergent phenomena. Entropy in that sense, if it's tied to that first person subjective experience, explaining it is, I mean, it might be really valuable for explaining that first person perspective. And then the question would be, okay, which parameters do we relax in order to maybe also be able to include and recover the zeroth person? But I really couldn't say right now with what I know.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah, and then also just a reminder, consciousness, the term itself, actually is, so for the zeroth person perspective, we probably wouldn't use the term actually because of how we currently identify consciousness as a first person subjective experience. And but are these people not conscious? Like, I don't think we want to say that either. So there's a lot of work and stuff that needs to be disentangled if we take this data seriously and start including that into our theories of consciousness, and possibly even later on in some scientific ones. Okay, given all this data, with all the caveats that I already told you, here's the challenge we have to solve and where the Ruliad will come in. One, physical reality is most likely an interface, a very convenient one, not objective truth. So things about like ontologies, like quantum fields as ontologies, or space-time being fundamental, they're helpful lenses, but we're probably not explaining the fabric of the universe, which, maybe we should look for something else. Number two, the self, subjectivity, the mind is a regulatory construct. It is not fundamentally real. Number three, and that ground of experience. So what currently we think is the first person perspective, we currently think, our ground of experience is this I experience in the world, which it is not, is actually an undifferentiated totality, not an emptiness or numbness or nothingness. Now, to be fair, sticking with undifferentiatedness, everythingness and nothingness is, of course, the same thing if you do not differentiate. So let's be careful with our words here, but I will be using the word everythingness or totality, even though there is no differentiation from nothingness, mostly because of how the cultural meaning of nothing that we have. So I'm going to stick with everything and totality. So now if we want to take this into account, maybe solve some issues that, longstanding issues in science too, we might be able to kick out some theories, alternatives to quantum mechanics, for example, probably something like a many worlds interpretation after you ever read, if we, try to solve these challenges. So it's a very worthwhile exercise to solve this challenge, because it will help us understand better which theories might be, more useful going forward versus others. And of course, explain the human experience, which is fascinating in itself, I think. Okay. This is where we come to a language, a framework that might help us give this substance. So again, philosophers have been trying for a while to tell us, there's a little bit more to experience than we scientists usually think about. But verbal language really doesn't cut it. It really does not. Especially not, if you put in like culture and the self being a construct. So again, also language is a construct for you that has very, very personal meaning, yada, yada, yada. It's just a mess. So why don't we try to find something that's a little bit more agnostic, a little bit more neutral? But it needs to be able to capture all these three challenges, especially needs to have a way to show an undifferentiated totality, which is probably the biggest challenge at this point. So, well, Stephen Wolfram actually gave us something to get us started, which is amazing. And I'm going to introduce you really briefly to his framework. It all started out back in I hope I'm saying this correct, in the 1980s. I mean, earlier for him, but I think as it was being published and catching on, which is the whole complexity thing. Life is complex, humans are complex, the environment is complex. Actually does not mean that the foundational pieces, the theories that explain them, have to be complex either. You can have something as simple as this rule. This is, I believe, rule 110. And just apply it to states, to like these little squares, make them white or black, and in each step update them according to the rules. So you see there, if you have 3 black squares, then the one in the next line will be white. As exercises we do as children when we play around. Now, as you see to the left, this can get you incredibly complex behavior where you don't really know what's going to happen next. Like, it's pretty unpredictable. It looks very complex. It looks not easy at all, even though this rule was so simple. And the underlying system, just a grid of black and white squares that get updated, line by line. Like, how hard can it be? And yet we get very fascinating behavior. Now, that's very important because that allows us to look for simplicity in order to explain complexity. The important concepts I need to introduce here at this point is exactly what I was saying. You can't really, know what comes next. Like, it just looks kind of chaotic and too complex to predict. Now, that's what would be called computational irreducibility. You just like the system itself is so unpredictable that you have to run the next step. There is no more efficient algorithm that can predict what's coming next. You actually just have to compute it, brute force it line by line by line. And that is a computationally irreducible behavior of the system. Now, there are possibilities where you can get reducibility. So I don't think this one, this, you see a
Here
little
there's
bit.
reducibility in the sense that there are like these this background texture, and sometimes there's like repeated elements, and like if you see part of a triangle, you might know like one of those white triangles. Like, let's say if you know how wide it is up top, then you know how tall it is on the left side.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can. So I think you're doing perfect. Yes. You do seem elements where you're like, oh, I might be able to predict this, but in this case, also at some point it fails you to some degree. But there is some part of some compressibility there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So these are 2 things that are really important. So again, like, can I predict the next step, or do I really have to compute it because there's no more efficient way to do it? Can I maybe guess what is, jump ahead, which makes it computationally reducible. Now, does this go away if I go to the next slide? No, it does not. Okay, how do I get these? How do I get
I
both?
can.
Can you do that for me? It would be amazing.
Yes, there we go.
Thank you.
All right, yeah.
And there's the third concept of equivalencing. So now this is going to be really important again for us as fitness optimized observers, right? So you have something very chaotic, completely unpredictable, and I'm going to do an equivalencing to get to something that's reducible. So I have 2 pictures here, and thank you, Dugan, for pointing me to this example back in the day at the summer school. Mm-hmm. So on the left side, you see a hexagonal cellular automata where you have little errors, it's hard to say, that update according to a certain rule. And we're trying to model fluid movements with these update rules. Now, this looks all pretty chaotic, and you run it, and it's just like these little errors, like fluctuating seemingly randomly. But you could start making averages, be like, okay, let me take 5, 6 hexagons here and, average the distance and keep doing that. And eventually you see something that actually, looks graspable, right? You have a barrier there and just like little eddies forming. So to us, that makes sense. That is something, and it will actually stay stable and predictable that way. So by having taken the averages of the like little minuscule rules underneath it, we are able to come to something that looks predictable or reducible. So that is what equivalencing does. And the assumption is the world is, full of information, kind of like the computer example, right? You have like the electrons and the circuits, and it's just too much. But we have these ways of equivalencing that, of creating this user interface icons, of creating this stable, persistent way of being in the world. That's why this concept is important. Okay, but we also, again, this framework is supposed to be able to recover physics or biology, the sciences, right? This is not just a fun language. This is supposed to be very, very useful. And actually, there's been a lot of work, especially with the physics project by all people on the Wolfram side, where yes, you can recover physics within this new way of describing what is, describing reality in terms of rules and updates and graphs. So here to the right, you have not a cellular automata, but a graph rewriting system. I'm not going to go into detail right now, but there's a rule of how you get from one step to the next with how the letters should be updated. And we can show, or it has been shown, that having certain concepts like causal invariance, meaning if you go through the path, like there's several ways to get from one node to an end node versus different paths, and to you as an observer, it doesn't matter which one it is. They all are causally invariant to each other. They do the same thing because you get to the same end node. If you put in something like foliation, that would be the red lines here. So splitting up the graphs in ways that helps you kind of get either show different reference frame or however you want to update time. That way you can also recover the phenomena that you see in general relativity, in like Einsteinian relativity, and of course the quantum theories. Superposition would be that you have different paths you can take, but you only care about getting from A to B. So that's great. The formalism it looks like, is going to allow us to recover all the physics we already know, while not relying on assumptions of space and time and physicality. That's already a big plus. Now you can take that to the maximum. Okay, so we have states, we have updates, we have rules, right? What if you apply all possible rules in all possible ways on all possible initial conditions? What is that like? Well, we cannot imagine that. That is just insanely complex, but you can think of this thing existing, and Stephen calls it the Ruliad. And the interesting thing about the existence of the Ruliad is if you do not constrain the system, so if you're not insisting on being in one graph, going through it in a specific way, but if you remove all the constraints, you actually end up potentially, you will end up somewhere in this totality. Now, the totality is something we definitely wanted to recover, right? So that's great. And again, it doesn't rely on physical assumptions. It just naturally generates out of the idea of computations being a foundational element of how we can reconstruct what we see. Any questions so far? All good. Okay, perfect. Now, the existence of the Ruliad actually gets us to some very fascinating insights, just the fact that it can exist. Again, it is a totality from which any and every type of universe can emerge. So we are living in a multiverse. It is all computations that could ever possibly be computed, and they are already computed, will be computing. There is no time, right? So this is a totality of all computations just existing, no time necessary. In that, the Ruliad is eternal and unmoving. It's an absolute completeness, meaning there is no outside view onto the Ruliad. You are only ever within the Ruliad. You only ever look out. You don't even look out. Like, there is nothing but the Ruliad. It's the air we breathe. There is nothing else. So we are expressions of the Ruliad. The way we see the world are expressions or equivalencing of the Ruliad. There is nothing but these computations, and then sliced in certain ways that's basically what this tells us. Interestingly, a little bit on the philosophical side, this would be a substance monism. So there's only one substance, computations, and they can express in a myriad of ways. The one we're familiar with is mind and matter. But, could be other ones, we don't know. But there's definitely not two separate substances, some foundational space-time, none of that. Again, us as observers, we exist as bounded entities. When we're not in the zeroth person perspective, we of course we don't see the vastness of it all. We only see a small slither of reality, the one around us, whatever that means. And that's kind of, and I think that's important to say, like, if you are the totality, if you are the Ruliad, there is no differentiation. We as small bounded entities, we will be describing that totality in like, oh, look, there's a state, oh, look, it updated in that way, whatnot. So again, this expression of states and updates rules, that is something that we as bounded observers observe. But if you are the totality, all of that would look just as an existing, eternal, unmoving totality. All right, now we have one big question. This is actually way too big to solve, but I just wanted to give it a try for the summer school. But before we get there, let's look at this quote to get us started. So the big question we have to solve, okay, well, if this is the totality of everything, an equation of the universe, if you want to say, well, of the multi-universe, then like, how do we get something, as small beings, a tree, whatever, an electron, how do we get it out of there? So let's start with this quote. The next day, during the second meditation, I had again waves of bliss, but permeated by even more thick yet dynamic silence. The experience of a thought and meditation is something like a drop of water falling onto a very quiet surface of water and creating ripples. But even better is the analogy of the ocean becoming a wave. Because when the faint idea of the thought comes, it is the ocean rising into a wave without losing its status of an ocean, remaining ocean with a slight stir in it. Stir is almost too strong a word because it entails an external something stirring. Flow is probably a better term. Again, there's nothing outside of the Ruliad, outside of the totality. It all is within it at any point in time. Okay, well,
Waves
you like
aren't
the quote?
themselves entities separate from the ocean.
Absolutely not. They will look separate, though, if they start to develop a point of view. And then they will think that they're bounded and separated. Which is kind of, again, here's where we're completely in speculative territory, but I wanted to think about it, so I did. This is basically coming from the everything, from the absolute, if you're familiar with the philosophy terms, to a differentiation, as it's nothing short of trying to explain the fall from grace or the first mover, which of course we haven't explained ever. So, but we can start. We can start with like taking this data seriously. So of all these things that we take as, this our normal experience as actually emergent phenomena, and applying Occam's razors, which tells us, okay, what is the most simple explanation we can do to get all of this out? And in my opinion, that probably would be attention coherence, like it was saying in the quote in the account. That's like waves forming, right? So there's some repetition, there's some predictability in that sense, there is some persistence, definitely a boundedness, if you ignore the totality that you're actually coming from. So if the Ruliad is all possibilities, so it is possible for there to be some type of repetitive element, some type of like coherence with certain elements. Now, this doesn't have to look simple whatsoever. It is just, simple in terms of a totality. And I called attention to coherence to give us a little bit like an intuition of that abstract possibility arising. So I'm thinking of it kind of like, okay, well, the most minimal thing out of the totality is really like is an eddy forming, and that eddy is kind of like sees itself as a constrained existence only when it develops a point of view. So it's looking back onto itself, which is kind of where you get the whole philosophical questions about consciousness from in the first place, right? You don't ask that if you never try to look back on your experience. But yes, differentiation would arise if you start developing a point of view. And again, it is evolutionary incredibly favorable to have a solid self model, which is kind of like this point of view from which you optimize everything. Now going a step further, asking about the self, so the first person asking that very question, we can basically at this point say, well, okay, the self, this first person perspective, is a process of coherence, like this little eddy within this everythingness, gaining a point of view, and that gives rise to the illusion of separation and a differentiated finite existence. It's this eddy believing, only itself exists because it can't see the totality anymore. Now the no self, so again, very typical human experience, apparently returning to a point of no self is actually letting go of that point of view, possibly even of that coherence, and resting in the totality. It's a being instead of a becoming. I think very important here, it's a process philosophy, right? So there's a process to the self. It's not a static entity that you can point at, which I hope a lot of philosophers will enjoy. But it is a process forming. And this is important for, we already said, the physics stuff, the matter stuff. The Wolfram framework looks like it will be able to explain nicely. Now we needed to recover the mind stuff, and that's exactly it. Our thoughts, our subjective experience probably is a coherent process arising from the totality. I made ChatGPT try to make an illustrative picture of what that might look like. And this is not me. This is just a smiling woman, because people keep asking me that question. But yeah, so if you think about the Ruliad, it being filtered through us, but again, remember, we are still the Ruliad, well, part of the Ruliad. And then the world emerges, the world of our subjective experience of a separate tree and a path, and thus emerges. Again, but it's still all part of the Ruliad. It's not actually separate from it. All right, it's a bit mind missing, but I think we'll see in a second also that it has a lot of potential. But coming back to the challenge that we're supposed to answer, I think the Wolfram framework actually is a great way to approach it. It gives us a language. For one, we can recover the patterns of the physical world with it. Number two, we can conceive of an emergence of self from such a totality as a coherence process, gaining a point of view. And number three, the ground of existence. So if everything is removed, is not a zero, is not a nothingness, which would be the case in a lot of normal, typical physicalist theories, but it is actually a totality that can be imagined to be a monism, an undifferentiated totality. Any questions? Okay. All right, let's go to the last part. This won't take a lot of time, also very fascinating. Some philosophy, we already talked about the monism. This is actually, which I only learned afterwards, one-to-one the example of Spinoza as God. I'm starting to deep dive into Spinoza, and the guy basically has been saying all the things we're currently rediscovering in neuroscience, so I'm a little offended that we're, still not. Anyway, this knowledge has been around for 350 years. But yeah, Spinoza's God, Spinoza said that, it's an infinite infinity. And from it, two modes, a lot of modes could come out, right? A multiverse. But for us humans, that would only be two, which is thought and extension, mind and matter. And they co-arise as kind of out of that monism. They're not separate from it. They're always part of it, So there's actually a lot of philosophical work that matches up perfectly with what we've been sketching out. Now, very important, especially this is more on the theory side for the Wolfram framework on the observer theory. So the Ruliad or the Wolfram framework needs an observer, right? If you have the totality of computation, well, if we want to explain the path of an electron, we just need that one graph, and we need that one initial state, and it being measured, so ending up in that one specific end state, right? So slicing up the Ruliad, the totality, into something very specific. So for the framework to work, to recover our physical theories, there needs to be an observer, somebody who does the slicing, who tells us, okay, we're going to single out this instance. And that is why there's been a lot of questions around the observer theory. And again, let's keep in mind that there is nothing outside of the Ruliad. There is no neutral view from above, which is always kind of what we assume in science. There's the person looking through the microscope and the thing under the microscope, they have nothing to do with each other. But that cannot be, because in the Ruliad, everything is part of the Ruliad. So the observer and the observed are tightly coupled, and we need to kind of parse that apart a bit. Basically, the observer is the chooser in this program. Like, the observer is choosing what empirical measurements we're trying to answer, which theories we're looking at, we're trying to recover general relativity, or we're trying to recover the quantum theories. So the observer is always a chooser while being also part of the framework itself. Therefore, there are two types of observers. I think that's very important. It's not currently there. Maybe it's not important. I think it's important. So type 1 is what we usually talk about in the observer, right? It's the entity that's kind of like stancing out a certain rule pattern and the foliation from the totality. It's, it's just kind of like a little, when you have when you bake at Christmas and you have the dough rolled out and you stance out. Yeah, that's basically what we need to do. Dough being the Ruliad, we need to stance out something that we want to explain, that we want to look at under the microscope. But there is the second observer, and that is the human observer, whose perception creates the world that needs to be explained in the first place. So the baker is the one doing the stancing again. Also, obviously, Ruliad is not the dough, because the Ruliad is everything, but trying to keep it simple. And there's important consequences of that. So if the type 2 observer, the human, the baker, is a coherent process with a point of view, the coherence, the requirement of coherence gets us boundedness and persistence, which is what we usually say are, at least we're for certain that an observer needs to have these two properties. Well, they come from the requirement of coherence, and also they then afford us a point of view, the persistence, making things predictable, right? So you start developing this idea of there is a single point. Now, but the really important part of this, and that is really what sets this type 2 observer apart from the other one, is that they, in their computation, need to account for their own coherence. So you need to compute the fact that you're bounded and persistent, and that, needs to be respected in the next computation step. That is an additional computation that's in there, and that the human observer, the type 2 observer, needs to respect. Now, given these properties, then the stancing out, the cookie cutter itself inherits these properties automatically, just from the fact that the baker has already determined what reality looks like. So they inherit the boundedness and the persistence. They do not need to explicitly account for it, but they have a very important functional role, which is, the observer will depend on the system you're trying to explain, and that is going to be their flavor that is important. Okay. Last but not least, consciousness, we've already talked about it really briefly. So currently don't have a good definition for it in the medical field. It's usually, okay, I'm awake, I'm grasping reality. Cognitive science is usually about reportable experience. You do an experiment and you ask people, oh, well, what about this? Did you pay attention to that? Can you recall this part of the experiment? And in philosophy of mind, it's consciousness usually set equal to having a subjective experience. Now, that doesn't need to be a reflexive one, so it doesn't need to be a subjective experience where I sit there and like, oh, I'm having an experience. What does this mean? It can just be, walking through life, being, I don't know, complete hyperfocus, completely absorbed by life, not thinking about anything philosophical at all, but just having this objective point of view is usually considered consciousness. Now, we all know from the data we've been seeing, and a few caveats, that the zeroth person perspective tells us that subjectivity is an emergent phenomena. So if at all, currently our ideas about consciousness is a question of consciousness is ours, not a fundamental property of the universe. So that, by the way, kicks out immediately a lot of theories on consciousness, like panpsychism, which are very popular these days, because, yeah, no, that makes no sense whatsoever. Anyway, also the question of qualia. Again, qualia was like this quality of having experience. I think philosopher Thomas Kuhn called it that which breathes fire into our equations of consciousness. It's supposedly indescribable. Well, yeah, also just an emergent phenomena. There is no what it's like in the zeroth person perspective. But we can probably situate it better. Now, it's important for the subjective consciousness, or consciousness is ours debate. Qualia is important. People go back and forth, but basically the discrepancy comes back to the fact that it's the third person scientists kind of fighting the subjectivity loving philosophers, and they're like, no, equations can't explain it, and scientists say like the equations explain it perfectly, it's just all an illusion, like get over it. Anyway, but no, if we actually use the framework we have developed so far for these philosophical questions, then we can explain why it's so indescribable, because it's a process, right, that's trying to catch itself. Because honestly, the question of qualia only ever comes about from people actually asking them, so reflexive consciousness. But it's trying, you can never quite grasp it because you are a process trying to catch yourself. So you have to, you have to get bigger and bigger in the sense of deconstruct, more and more constraints on the process. And by the time you're big enough to catch the whole process, it's gone, because you're the totality, as we know in the zeroth person, qualia disappears. So it is really just that. It's just that the self itself is a process, and that it can never quite catch itself, which I think is a way more useful definition of qualia than all this back and forth that we've been having. Okay, last but not least, I think I said the most important things already. This is more a slide to remind me to tell you guys something. The problem with there's different problems here we've been trying to address, right? One is philosophy and the science of consciousness, which becomes more and more important with AI, questions of morality, ethics, and so on. It's, there used to be fancy, philosophers, who knows, these people just having fun. But now this is starting to become very much real life questions, especially if AI can suffer, will it make us suffer? How do we align it? All questions of consciousness. So we have not been able to talk about it, honestly, from my perspective, in a very constructive way, mostly because verbal language is completely ill-situated for that. And I do believe this is a framework that can help us, especially because it finally resolves a really important point, which is no subjective or first-person experience is not the ground of existence. It is something else. And if you take that into account, like, first of all, a lot of theories of consciousness are already gone, which is nice, and we can develop others better. And now we have a mathematical language to it. But then again, of course, what it's like to experience it, you actually have to experience it. Yes, the breathing the fire into the equation is you living the equations, you being the process of these equations being alive. So that will always, be a little interesting, but that is huge. We'll have a language that's very agnostic. We can stand across cultures, and we can situate phenomena that happen very contentious in very clear-cut ways. So great. Hopefully will also help us to figure out how selves get constructed, and with that, the whole AI alignment, who is conscious, who's not conscious, moral questions, all of that. But also on the more science side of things, if we do, I think it's a great framework to really showcase how important the observer is, and that way we hopefully can make progress on very old questions that we haven't been able to solve, like quantum gravity, for example, or the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. So that's all super important, and that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Damaris. Peshin Chen asks, or Peter, aka, is there any way to quantify qualia, or is it still in a qualitative level, and does it vary by person?
Yeah, so qualia is, that's why people fight about it so much. It is because it is that that first person experience that is only accessible to you. So it's the you being like, oh, this redness of red, the beautiful, what's it, sunset, right? Like this makes me feel something. It feels like something being alive. It feels like something having this experience. There is something to it. And yeah, we can look at brains, and we can be like, please look at red, and then measure that. But those are always only correlations. And people have been just very insistent on that experience itself being undescribable and inaccessible to science, and asking science to open up towards that instead of like staying so limited to its own like detached view. Does that answer your question? Did I answer the question?
Right. So qualia is the experiencing of sensory input on some level.
It is partially, yeah. It is basically an experience of the self, trying to catch something, and the self again being a model, a cohesive model that helps us survive, and that includes thoughts, even higher order thoughts. So it is
Right.
this quality. It is living the correlations, is living the explanations, like going through the process, being the process of computing that, grasping basically, and in that sense, it is qualitative.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. So that sensory data, I mean, being perceived with like a biological apparatus and like this like attention agent, this consciousness attending to that data lends very easily to put that into a concept and say this is a self doing the experiencing.
Yeah, it's basically that's the same. Again, like subjectivity of first person accounts and all the explanation and theories we have around it. Like it's not like they're wrong just because the zeroth person exists, right? It's something we still the framework needs to recover. And that's yes, why that's why there's basically the same matchup. I think the question, which it seems more like a misunderstanding between different disciplines and really a big controversy at this point, but I don't know, is that some people thought the self having this experience as a static entity, kind of like a specific neural circuit in the brain, and therefore you can point towards it and you should be able to, figure out why it's having that experience of something. But the whole thing being a process, it's pretty obvious, I think, but I guess it's still question mark. However, you don't even need to go all the way to the Ruliad framework or zeroth person if you just allow the self to be a process, which I think most cognitive scientists at this point agree anyway. Then yeah, it's a process trying to catch itself, and that lines up beautifully with a whole coherent process emerging out of a totality.
Right. So the self is more defined when there's attention being placed onto one's own apparatus or one's own
It's
consciousness. Like I'm the one conscious or something like that.
mm, I'm well, we don't have an answer, like
Uh-huh.
a definite answer on that. It is much more likely though that kind of like you're hungry or you're angry, but actually what happens is there's a whole host of things happening in your body, but you're not aware, right? You just
Yeah.
get this biological summary. And the self, the idea of the self, if you reflect on it, if like, oh, who am I? What am I feeling right now? Like it can change, right? Depending on if you're happy or not,
I
if
was gonna
you're
bring
10
this
years
up.
old or
Like
30 years.
I had a friend and they were telling me about their dog, how silly their puppy is, and always
Mhm.
running around and just has no self awareness or doesn't seem to be like, it's just doing its thing. And I asked, okay, so when your dog is hungry, do you think your dog is like thinking, oh, I'm hungry? Or do you think that the dog thinks, oh, hunger, without like tying it back to like the self? So it's like, you get the signal of your
Yeah,
stomach is empty, you want nourishment, your body needs it, and you just kind of perceive hunger as like a sensation, and you're not like having the thought that I'm the one who's hungry.
exactly. Yes. And that is, I think, really important. And I don't know why it's still a controversy. But yes, the self as this thing that sustains you in going to the world in a way that you persist, right? So like hunger will, or anger is a great example too, right? It will push you into action that is supposed to help you keep persisting. And hunger does the same. Like you don't have to have a concept of I in order to like be like, oh, let's grab that berry. That berry looks really great. Let me eat that, right? So it's and that is why the self is actually more. The self is an attractor in your neural network landscape. It's just a very big attractor. Now some people actually have it comes in more stable and less stable, which that's also a fascinating rabbit hole we're not going to go down. But yeah, so it is a dynamical process within an attractor landscape. And so it can act just fine because that's what it was designed for without having language or having a concept of an I. And I think that's where usually the misunderstanding between different disciplines comes in.
Yeah, I mean, another thought is sort of I think that Yosha Bach kind of talks about the notion of a self kind of is the same vein as like you develop a theory of mind for other people. Sometimes people do this, right? You kind of like, oh, there's another person. This is what they're on about. This is what motivates them. This is their history. You kind of have like this model for them. This is what's going on inside of their mind, right? Try to predict that, and then if you do that to your own self, you say, okay, well, I must be this kind of person with, well, I have this history, and I think these types of thoughts, and I'm this type of person. Like you kind of develop a theory of mind for yourself, and then that, or for your own existence, and that becomes like yourself, the self that you
It becomes
are
the
develop.
narrative self.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. It becomes the narrative self, but the self itself as a functional unit exists before that. So that's why you can act on hunger and anger as a functional unit. It always exists, and but it is a very definite attractor of all possible. Like it's not, you could be anything, everything. It is a very clear set. They're probably actually. It is probably like a global activation that is so common for your existence that it just like really deep riches. It's just something that keeps happening. Now, when you try to actually use the reflexive mind to talk about it, that's when it becomes like the little voice in your head narrative, which only ever captures the surface phenomenon. Because that voice in your head, that's very, very low information density. I know we always be like, oh, creative thought and humans and blah, but honestly, like that is so low information density in comparison to like all the subconscious processes with which you're going through the world. And so that is just like narratively tagging on labels. And they will depend on how you've learned to slice up the world, what type of neural mechanisms, weighing, blah, blah, blah you have, how you use these labels. And it just helps with like, trying to keep the conscious mind, the conscious awareness mind about the threshold of consciousness in the subjective sense, to keep that one coherent, which is great, serves the function, but that's pretty random. That's pretty random labeling.
Brady is asking, I've been confused for a while why the Ruliad is not considered infinite dimensional everywhere, when all possible rules means all connections at every step.
It's not?
I I would say that, it's a set of all like mathematically defined things, or the set of all rules or systems that are described by rules. So I
I think the
think
question of
infinite dimensional
dimensionality.
spaces would be considered objects that are described in the Ruliad. If they can be described by rules, like a Hilbert space, for instance, is a mathematical construction, so it would definitely be in this
Yeah.
platonic realm of all the things described by symbolic logic. As I like to think about the Ruliad. And insofar as our universe is sort of, you have all these constituent elements, and they obey physical laws, that there are rules being played out between these things, and it can be described within a set of rule-based systems. So in that sense, our universe embeds itself somewhere within the Ruliad, and we should be so lucky if, for instance, we lived in a universe where the gloves come off, things don't obey physical law, there are no patterns, it's just sort of like Adventure Time randomness. you know uh, you put a rock into like a box, you close the box, you open the box, and dragons come out. I think would be in a totally different like ball game.
Yeah, but it should be a possibility within the totality, right?
I don't know. So would that type of universe, where it's just like Calvin ball randomness, um, would that be described in the set of all and the Rulian? Would it be described as
I mean,
obeying rules?
it wouldn't be persistent, but probably. But could it like jump up and fall down? I don't know.
um, Brian, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, more a comment than a question. So early on in the presentation, you pulled up Rule 110 and draw a circle around an interesting region. You don't need to bring it up again. It's what I was sort of imagining is if you had an image of the Ruliad and you would draw a circle around the region that is this meeting, right? Because this meeting is probably a very tiny piece of it. And what I was thinking about is, well, let's look at a few other regions of the Ruliad. There's the regions that's me. Right. And within the region that's me, there's the region that's the thing that I call myself. Right. And then there's the region that's you.
Mhm.
And I was sort of trying to think about what are the kind of interconnections and interactions between the region that's myself, the region that's you and yourself, and the region is this meeting.
Yeah. So that's a very hard question, because what you call me and you, right? So we are living in these pockets of reducibility because we believe we currently have a good grasp on the chaos. So we're living in these equivalence pockets of reducibility, which all map though, right? Kind of like this one, and they all map to parts of the totality, if not like maybe all of it, and it contributes in all kind of ways. I don't know. And so
Yeah,
you
I
would
would
have
say
to
that they're
answer that
mapped
question.
from, like, you have like reality, and then you have coarse gradings on that.
Okay, so if you take the Ruliad as reality, then yeah, the coarse graining gets you to these pockets of reducibility, which is me and Brian and you, and this physical space and the virtual meeting that we're having, and the fact that it even exists. But in the end, like there's some clear mappings or rules connecting them. However, that is so vastly high dimensional, to use the word, on how that all might
That's
connect.
true. That's true. But the question that was behind what I was asking
Okay.
is, does that coarse graining make a zeroth person perspective not sensible?
Not sensible. So the coarse graining,
The
the
coarse
coarse graining
graining,
is the first person. So the coarse graining is the first
e-
person.
exactly. And for there to
Mhm.
be a zeroth person, is it my zeroth person or is it
There's
the
no mine.
zeroth,
There's no mine. There is only all of it.
which
That's
impl right, which implies that there's some pattern that me and you and Dugan and other
exactly.
people share.
Yeah, yeah, totally. We're all connected, as some people would like to say. I just don't
Yeah,
like
and
their interpretation.
let me express a little bit of skepticism of that,
Yes.
because for better or for worse, everything that you've been saying so far, you've been expressing in human, right? And human is kind of a relatively new concept. It's only like 100 million years old, where QCD is more like 4 billion, well, 16 billion years old. Pick a number. Where was that zeroth person perspective a billion years ago?
Oh, so there's no time in the zeroth person. So that question dissolves for the zeroth person itself. This is just a question that we're asking from our first person. And even QCD is basically just a way of the first person to find patterns, explain patterns, think about patterns. Again, pockets of reducibility. So even that is an equivalence concept. So what was always there, if we take the Ruliad seriously as a concept, then what was always there was the Ruliad. And the idea of time and space, I didn't say it explicitly, was in the quotes, but time and space is also an emerging thing. And so us, being 100 million versus something else being maybe older, all of that is just constructs. It's constructs of the first person of the equivalencing, including theories that were built, like QCD.
James had to jump. See you next time, James. All right, Flo had a question. Do you have any thoughts on how the perception of time is altered by meditative states or sensory deprivation?
Don't know about sensory deprivation. If it does the same thing as these deep meditative states, there is no time. It's completely dissolves. So time, and I'm not sure what the newest neuroscience theory is on that. But it's the perception of time comes from stitching together moments that we experience, and so time usually is a narrative that we have that we explain ourselves going back, and or doing a prediction of like, well, it was always like that, now I'm expecting this. But time itself is, even neuroscientifically speaking, though we do have clocks, we do have chemical clocks in the brain that can maybe serve as a timekeeper, though they don't quite function the same, for example, for neurodiverse people. And neurodiverse people still have an experience of time, though it's a little warped. So it is definitely, even in the first person, a questionable concept. Now time is more interesting in the scientific worldview, and of course we age, right? The seasons, so there is some changes in the physical world that gives us a notion of time. But some cultures, for example, in I believe somewhere in the Amazon, so where you don't have seasons, they don't have an expressed concept of time. It's also very much a Western concept, or, well, people who think about the world the way we do. So it is also a cultural construct in that sense. However, most importantly, it completely dissolves, like also the concept of space, which is also a relational concept, by the way, right? It's between one point and the other, being different, being separated. Again, no separation, no differentiation. So also the concept of space dissolves in the zeroth person perspective. Was it the question? I always forget the question if I talk.
Well, it was about the perception of time being altered by
Yeah,
meditative
no
states.
time perception. Time doesn't exist.
I would conjecture that, like, I've never tried a sensory deprivation tank or anything like that, but I would guess that, like, your sense of time is sort of, or the frame rate in our brain is sort of, we have this like 100 millisecond delay that's just the sequential firing of neurons, and being so many neurons long for our vision to like be processed. It takes like 100 milliseconds, excuse me. So like the physical time delay on the signaling in our neurons sets up a particular rhythm of experiences, frame by frame experiences, and so that kind of dictates how fast we go from one moment to the next in our mind's perception. It's not really a meditative state, but when you get into a car crash or something like this, something is happening physically, and
Yeah.
you get into this like amped up mode of your brain actually like flips like a switch, and then like starts pumping in oxygen, and it's this heightened sense of awareness, so they can make decisions faster in time, and your brain actually like runs faster, and it's like frame rate, and this is like for short bursts. Your the physiolog your brain cannot physiologically sustain that for any sustained length of time, but it can do it in short bursts, and I think it's an interesting thing. Of course, and then there are animals that are smaller than us that have smaller brains, and they process information faster, because the signal length to get across the brain is shortened.
Yeah, that would make sense. And that, yes, also, I think, I'm not an expert, so this is like folk story type level knowledge, but I think for the internal timekeeping, so that circuitry that we do have that kind of pings us regularly is dopamine driven, if I'm correct. So that also explains then why time perception changes so much when you're in settings that you really love versus like when you're really bored. Also has to do just with the neurochemicals you have available in that moment and how it affects like that internal timekeeping that your brain does anyway, besides the binding problem. So the 100 milliseconds of binding a perceptual unit together. Yeah, it's definitely a construct.
What you said about the tribes, that were near the equator, they didn't have seasons, so they didn't have time as much, concept of time passage. I mean, they would still have like day and night, right?
Yes, they do. It's more so the okay, again, not an expert on this. Yeah.
Are these like tribes in a forest?
Yeah.
Okay, so then,
So
but that's
yeah.
interesting. So like, there's light and dark, a day and night cycle, but it's like if you're in a rainforest, you're not going to be able to like locate the sun as effectively. So like sometimes you see it and you see like the directionality
Yeah.
change, but you're
I don't
not
think
going to be connected to like the stars and the seeing the Milky Way circle overhead all the time, and you're not going to be
I
able
don't think
to.
that's not really important. So remember, everything we perceive is in order to have a self-model that helps us survive. Now, with this specific tribe, I believe, is because they live in a complete abundance. So there's always food, there's no changing seasons, so they don't have to
Yeah,
plan for winter, and so on. They were very isolated, so there was very little unpredictability in terms of warfare, just I guess like so there was no need for them to plan, and therefore time
right.
was not
So
an important parameter for the self-model. And so the language doesn't really have a structure that you would usually expect for like a time, like where time is important, because time is important for as a parameter to chop up your world in order to survive well.
yeah,
And
beyond day
that's
and
where
night
time.
cycle, it's like they have no concept of a year. They don't know that, for instance, that
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
this
It's like
like
obviously
yearly
there's
rhythm that happens elsewhere in the
yeah,
world, and
yeah. No,
just like
this
they
day
probably
and night.
don't celebrate
Yeah,
birthdays, for
it's
instance. They just
yeah.
like it was just one day to the next, and that's it.
Yes, yeah, there's just like living every day, and it's I'm assuming like day and night would be more like us breathing air, right? Like you don't think about it; it just
Mm-hmm.
happens because it is always there, it's always safe, um, things like that. But again, there's also controversy around like how they were studied and whatnot. So, but time perception again, very much a cultural concept.
Brian says in chat that the phases of the moon would stand out insofar as they might be
Right.
able to see the moon. If they're in a thick canopy or something like this, then they might not even be able
Yeah,
to.
no, again, being able to perceive it is not the question. It's how important is it for survival, to become an important parameter and with which you structure your perception, and therefore your, in this case, perception of time. And unless you have regular flooding each full moon, like again, also the phases of the moon are not going to be important. This tribe specifically, importantly, also had very, very low amount of mysticism or religion. So they had a bit, but not a lot, like very, very little, which is, you would expect of a culture that is never really faced with survival fears, because what do you need religion for? It's just helping you deal with these mind issues, and that is helping you to like give you some stability in the world that you don't perceive otherwise. And since they had so much stability, they didn't even develop much of a religion or mysticism. And so the moon itself, again, like unless it is threatening, it probably wouldn't have made an impact on any important parametrization of their perception.
So they had less mysticism because
Yeah.
there was less like need to have. There was less scarcity. Like a lot of mysticism in the ancient worlds, like tied with the harvest or something like this.
Yeah. No, I think the saying goes, tell me what your physical environment looks like, and I tell you which type of religion you have developed.
Uh-huh.
So there's a clear pattern there, and they did need that.
Yeah, I guess. I was just thinking more about this, like tribal nation in the Amazon or something like this. Like, if you can't see the moon directly, or like sometimes you see it like through the trees, but the phases of the moon, I guess. Sometimes it would be lighter at night than other nights, and that would be like a monthly cycle. So there's
Yeah,
that.
but you were saying, right? Attention mechanisms are very important, and you only put attention on this thing you need to error correct for. So my religion is worship of the, I'm assuming, Ruliad.
Ruled.
No, ruled. What is that?
Oh, it's spell checking.
Really?
Yes, Ruliad. Okay.
Okay. It's worship of the, what's my environment? uh, well, clearly a computer scientist, because, and I think that's an important caveat. I did talk about in the community essay. which is like we are using computation as a way to try to get to these abstract ideas. Back in the medieval ages, the newest scientific theories were all about the universe as a book, right? Because book was the newest technological invention. So again, we should be careful about that, or just be mindful of that. But we do know that computational approaches currently just have so much more explanatory power than pretty much anything else we have at our disposition currently. And so, yeah, I mean, Brian, I would say your religion currently is that the stability in your life that you need is to make sense of the computation in your life. That's what I'm thinking.
Beautiful. Thank you, Damaris.
Thank you, Dugan, for having me. This was fun.
Wonderful presentation and lively discussion. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the live stream, and we will see you all again next time.